the Rock and Roll Unraveled Show. Welcome to another Rock and Roll Unraveled show. I'm Derek Shelmerdine, and we're taking a look at the Liverpool scene before the Beatles. I mean, that's when the Fab Four version of the band came about after Pete Best sadly moved on, and Ringo, well, he completed the iconic lineup in the summer of 1962. Now, Liverpool in the 50s and 60s had one of the most exciting music scenes in the country. I mean, clubs were popping up all over the city. Now, these are mostly jazz clubs, and they had a sort of grudging acceptance of skiffle. Now, these clubs were sometimes modern jazz, but often they were traditional jazz or trad jazz. And that was a very British take on New Orleans jazz. And skiffle groups themselves emerged in the mid-1950s, and they were often picking up songs from the sort of American folk blues tradition. And a great example would be Lonnie Donegan. I mean, he was one of the real pioneers in this area. And his first hit single came in 1956 with Rock Island Line and a B-side of John Henry, and they were both Lead Belly covers. Now, Rock Island Line's often cited as one of the great inspirations that people say for picking up the guitar or sitting on a drum stool and forming a band. Skiffle groups tended to use a guitar, maybe a couple of guitars, and a one-string T-chest bass and washboard. Now, the washboard was a corrugated iron device, actually designed for washing clothes, but it was reinvented as a sort of percussion instrument, and it was played with sewing thimbles on the fingers, and you'd then strum the washboard up and down, and it made a terrific sound. Has to be heard to be believed. But as time rolled on, the jazz clubs progressively started to accept beat music, albeit begrudgingly. But that's because skiffle groups and rock and roll were becoming more and more popular, and these bands were morphing into beat groups. Now, beat groups are subtly different, with usually a couple of guitars and drums, and the recently introduced electric bass guitar. I mean, this is one of the things that made a real difference in the music at that particular time. Gave a really powerful driving force behind the rhythm section. And they'd have a singer or two in the band. Sometimes that was one of the guitarists or the bass player. Very occasionally it might be the drummer. Or it was quite likely to be somebody standing at the front of the band with a mic and no particular instrument of their own. Now, some of the Liverpool groups who started out as skiffle bands, well, they went on to international fame. And the Quarrymen might ring a bell with one or two people, but they'll feature quite heavily in the story as we walk through the era. Others weren't really quite as successful. They were very successful locally, but never quite managed to transition even to national fame. But the vast majority of these groups were semi-pro groups. They had lots of fun, I can attest to that. But they had very little acclaim. I can also attest to that. Now, most of the music at the time was a take on American jazz, blues, R&B, rock and roll. I mean, there were covers, basically. There were cover versions. Very few bands were writing their own material at this time. One or two were. Billy Fury actually wrote quite a lot of his own material, but one of the great songs that popped up from time to time was the Miracles, You've Really Got a Hold on Me. Now, they put that out in 1962, actually written by Smokey Robinson, and as it says on the label, produced by Smokey. And the song itself is the first one we're going to open the show with, and this is the Miracles and their original version of You've Really Got a Hold on Me. Liverpool had its very own recording studio. Set up by Percy Phillips in 1955, he opened the Phillips Sound Recording Services at his home in 38 Kensington in Liverpool. It started out 1925 selling motorbikes and bicycles from a small shop in Brunswick Road, Liverpool 7. And there he sold and recharged batteries and also sold radios. But by the 1950s, he was selling more electrical products than batteries. The old battery business was on the wane, as it were. And he noticed that records and record players were selling well, so he abandoned the batteries in favour of record players and records. And in the mid-1950s, that was when he decided that it was time to open his own recording studio. And in early '56, he recorded one of the first skiffle records in Liverpool with Tony Allen, who was the singer with the Blue Mountain Boys. Now, the clubs were popping up all over the place. By the time we get to 1957, in fact, on the 16th of January was when the legendary Cavern Club opens its doors in Matthew Street at number 10, and that opened as a jazz club, and it was Alan Sitner that actually opened it. And that first night saw appearances by the Merseybeat Jazz Band, the Wall City Jazzmen, Ralph Watmuff's jazz band, and the Coney Island Skiffle Group. And you can see the sort of percentage there of skiffle to jazz, and that's pretty much how it was in the second half of the 1950s. And then towards the end of that year, the Mardi Gras Club opened at Mount Pleasant, and that had the walls on the club had murals painted by local artist Bob Percival. The club itself was co-owned by Jim Ireland and a guy called Stan Roberts, who'd won the football pools. So the financing came from a nice win there. Jim Ireland was one of the characters who was really quite influential in the 50s and early 60s Liverpool story. I mean, he managed people like the Swinging Blue Jeans and the Escorts. And in fact, the Merseybeat Jazz Band pop up again because they were one of the regular bands at the Mardi Gras. I mean, the Merseybeat Jazz Band have been around since the late 1940s. And another mover and shaker of the time, Alan Williams, he opened the Jacaranda Club in the end of 1958 on Slater Street. Alan Williams was very involved with the Beatles in their early days, and he's the guy who actually booked them into Hamburg for their first trip there. Another couple of clubs opening up towards the end of the 50s. One was the Sink Club in Hardman Street in the basement of the Rumbling Tom Coffee Bar. Now that actually used a sink plug and chain as proof of membership. A rather nifty piece of marketing, I think. And Brian Casser opened the Casanova Club in Temple Street. Brian Casser, really interesting character. I mean, before that, he'd been doing national service in Germany, and that's where he met Bill Wyman, and they formed a skiffle group together. Well, one of the people who really did find some serious international success was Jerry Marston of Jerry and the Pacemakers. Around the sort of 1956 57 mark, Jerry Marston's father bought him an acoustic guitar, and Jerry formed the Jerry Marston Skiffle Group with his brother Fred on drums and a couple of friends on washboard and T-chess bass. Now, Brian O'Hara joined them a little later, and he's the guy that went off and formed the Two J's, which eventually became the Foremost. 1958-ish, Jerry Marston's Skiffle Group morphed into Jerry and the Mars Bars, and Jerry's father was managing them, and he tried to get permission to use the Mars Bar name. Sadly, no permission was forthcoming, so they became Jerry and the Pacemakers, and they shortly became the classic lineup of Jerry, guitar and vocals, Fred drums, with Les Chadwick on bass and Les Maguire on piano. But sadly, one of the people who didn't achieve anything like the fame he should have done was saxophonist Howie Casey. I mean, he comes well back into the story very shortly. But around late 1959, he formed Derry and the Seniors with Brian Griffith on guitar and Derry Wilkie as a singer. But one of the real success stories from this particular period was solo artist Billy Fury. And on the 18th of April 1958, he actually recorded at Percy Phillips' studio as well. And the date from the studio log gives the item as Youth with Guitar, 1 10-inch double-sided disc. But Billy Fury's big break came on the 1st of October 1958, when he actually performed on stage at a Marty Wilde concert. That's the Larry Parnes Extravaganza show at Birkenhead's Soldo Theatre. Now, what was happening was Marty Wilde was headlining the show, and he had some support there from Vince Eager and the John Barry Seven. And previously, Ronald Wycherley had sent a demo tape to Larry Parnes, and Larry invited him to come and meet them at the Soldo that night. Well, they met backstage in the interval, and what Billy Fury was hoping to do was to interest Marty Wilde in recording one of his songs, but it turned out a lot better than that, because Larry Parnes invited him to open the second half and sing the songs himself. So he did, and gave an impromptu appearance and performed Margot, Don't Knock Upon My Door, and Maybe Tomorrow. Well, Parnes liked him, signed him up, led to a record contract with Decca, and he appeared the following night at the Extravaganza show. And from Ronald Wycherley, he became Billy Fury. Larry Parnes did like to change the name of his artist to something a little bit fiery. Well, Billy Fury found himself in his first recording session at the end of November, recorded Maybe Tomorrow, and it was actually written by Billy Fury, and it gave him his first #1 hit, gave him an 18 actually, and it began a run of hit singles that lasted until 1966. So one of Liverpool's real success stories there. And the Quarrymen, who eventually became the Beatles. Now they finally reach our story. In July of 1958, they had their first recording session at Percy Phillips' home. And they recorded Buddy Holly's That'll Be the Day, and a second track was a Paul and George composition, and that was In Spite of All the Danger. The lineup that day was George and Paul and John on guitar and vocals, Colin Hanton on drums, and John Lowe on piano. Now, interestingly, the date's slightly disputed. There's a blue plaque on the wall that gives the date as the 14th, but the studio website itself gives the date as the 12th of July. And the cost disputed as well slightly. The plaque thinks it's 17-6, and the studio suggests it was 11-3. And for anybody not familiar with old money, old British money, 17-6 is a little short of £1, and 11-3 is a little over 50 pence. And another great band starting out at the end of the 50s was the Undertakers. I mean, at the time, they were Bob Evans and the Five Shillings, and they became the Vegas Five in 1959, and that was with Bob Evans and included singer Jeff Nugent. And coming back to Brian Casser, he pops up a lot here. He opened the Casanova Club. He'd formed a skiffle group with Bill Wyman, and at the back end of 1959, he decided to form Cass and the Casanovas. And as the band developed, the lineup became Brian Casser, vocals and guitar, Adrian Barber on guitar, John Hutchinson on drums, and Johnny Gustafson on bass, and they actually became the Big Three. Now, the Undertakers and the Big Three were two of the best live bands on the Liverpool scene at that time. Absolutely no doubt about that in my mind. Both only ever had minor chart successes, and sadly never found any wider fame. But I mean, I remember seeing them at the time, and they were both awesome bands on the live stage. Now I think it's time for another piece of music. Now this particular one's got its roots back in December 1959, and it's Do the Mashed Potatoes that was released by Nat Kendrick and the Swans. Now that's actually James Brown plays piano and calls out the song title during the song. Nat Kendrick was actually James Brown's drummer, and if you check the label, it's credited to Desi Rosier, which is actually a pseudonym for James Brown. But this is a 1963 B-side, and this is the awesome Undertakers with Do the mashed potatoes. You're listening to the Rock and Roll Unravelled show with Derek Shelmerdine, author of the book Rock and Roll Unravelled. We're taking a look at the Liverpool scene, really, before the Beatles scored their first hit single, Love Me Do. Not just the clubs and bands, but also the movers and shakers, the guys that made it all happen. There's a whole load of information in this particular show. To peruse it at your leisure, you can find it all in the accompanying blog for the show, and that's at www.rockandrollunravelled.com. Now, the more clubs were opening in the summer and autumn of 1959. I mean, the Casbah Club opened in Haywards Green, West Derby. It was opened by Mona Best in the cellar of a house, and the house had previously been owned by the local Tory party as its headquarters. Now, Mona Best is the mother of Pete Best, who joined the Beatles almost exactly a year after the Casbah Club opened. Now, she was inspired by the Two Eyes Coffee Bar in London, and that's the spiritual home of skiffle. And the name was also inspired, not from a club though, but from a movie, Tangiers. And the club itself was a members-only coffee club. A lot of these clubs weren't licensed, but it claims to have the largest-selling Coca-Cola account in Liverpool. John Paul and George helped decorate the club with various paintings, and the Quarrymen played there on the opening night. Now, they were replacing George's group, the Les Stewart Quartet, and what had happened was that the Les Stewart Quartet had been practicing, and George and Ken Brown fell out with the rest of the group, so they stormed off, and that's why the Quarrymen had this particular gig at the last minute. So it's interesting to contemplate what may have happened if they hadn't had that argument that night. The Les Stewart Quartet had played that opening gig at the Casbah, and maybe George had never joined the Quarrymen, and the Beatles would have been a very, very different outfit. Well, something to mull over, I think. Over to the Downbeat in Victoria Street. That opened in 1960. And another one that opened as a jazz club. And this was another club that was run by Jim Ireland and decorated by local artist Bob Percival. This was one of the smaller clubs, probably about 300 or so capacity. But in the early 60s, it became a big club because the beat groups were really starting to dominate the scene. It later became well known as a soul venue in Liverpool. And still on the club scene, Alan Williams took over the Wyvern Social Club about the same sort of time. Now, there were lots and lots of groups popping up at the beginning of 1960, and one of them was the Sand Storers, and that was formed by Billy Ashton, later became Billy J. Kramer, and the band itself went through a number of name changes, one of which was Billy Ford and the Phantoms, but they settled on Billy Kramer and the Coasters. Now, Brian Epstein approached them to manage them, and Billy Kramer was very keen, but the Coasters didn't want to turn professional. They wanted to keep their apprentice jobs. So Brian Epstein had a hunt round, and he found the Dakotas. They're actually based in Manchester, but Brian Epstein managed to persuade them to become Billy Kramer's backing group with the enticement of a second contract, which was a recording contract in their own right. So you'll find quite a few Dakotas singles of that time in the sort of Shadows vein they were. Now, Billy Kramer became Billy J. Kramer after a suggestion by John Lennon. He was the one who suggested the J. So they became Billy J. Kramer and the Dakotas, and had quite a bit of success. The Searchers formed around this sort of time as well. They started out as the backing group for Johnny Sandon. And the Undertaker's name came about in a very interesting way. The Vegas Five, as they were, somehow the Liverpool Echo made a mistake with the billing, and instead of billing them as Vegas 5, they billed them as the Undertakers. So we have the local newspaper, the Liverpool Echo, to thank for the name The Undertakers, which the band obviously liked because they hung on to it. Sam Leach made his first promotion on the 1st of April 1960. He became a very, very influential promoter. And in an interview, he claims to have made £1,000 on that night of his first promotion. £1,000 in 1960 would buy you an awful lot of stuff. And one of the quite famous clubs also started in the spring of 1960. That was the Iron Door. It opened at Temple Street. Now, this was a big club. This one had a capacity for about 1,600 people. The building itself had previously been used for butter packaging, and they very much embraced a different ethos than the Cavern. They had a much more flexible attitude to the musical genres, and they'd have jazz and beat musicians jamming together there. There's a plaque on the building that suggests that this is the, quotes, cradle of Merseybeat, and the Searchers became quite a strong association with the Iron Door. And in the sort of early 60s, it was known by various names: the Liverpool Jazz Society, the Storyville Jazz Club. Later, it was actually known as the Pyramid Club. A really interesting session on the 10th of May 1960. Larry Parnes, Billy Fury's manager, was looking for a backing band for an upcoming UK Billy Fury tour, and Alan Williams arranged an audition at his Wyvern Social Club. Now, Casa the Casanovas auditioned, but unsuccessfully, but Larry Parnes gave them one of his other acts to back on a tour. That was Duffy Power. And the Silver Beatles, they were also at that audition, and that was John Paul, George, Stu Sutcliffe, and Tommy Moore on drums. Now, Tommy Moore was late for this, and Johnny Hutchinson of Cass and the Casanovas stood in, but sadly the Silver Beatles failed their audition. But they, like Cass and the Casanovas, they managed to pick up another one of Larry Parnes' acts, and they backed Johnny Gentle on his Scottish tour. And drummer Tommy Moore decided enough was enough, end of the road, and he quit the group at the end of that particular tour. But in the early summer of 1960, a couple of interesting backing bands who went on to have quite successful individual careers. I mean, but Billy Fury released That's Love, one of his own compositions, and the record label credits the With the Four J's. Now, the Four J's became the Foremost, and quite successful they were. Another one's really quite interesting, a bit of a diversion. This was when Royston Ellis was in Liverpool and playing at the Jacaranda Club. This is in June of 1960. Royston Ellis was a beat poet who liked rock and roll bands to back him. He liked a sort of fusion of beat poetry and rock and roll. And John Lennon and Stuart Sutcliffe in a band called the Dissenters backed him that night. And on Royston Ellis's website, he suggests that it was after that particular gig that they were inspired to change their name from the Silver Beatles spelt double E to Silver Beatles spelt EA. There were other rock luminaries enjoyed a sort of fusion of poetry and rock and roll as well. Jimmy Page played with Royston Ellis at the Mermaid Theatre in July 1961, and Hank Marvin, Tony Meehan and Jet Harris backed him around the same sort of time, and they of course became the original Shadows. Howie Casey was still moving forward nicely. Derry and the Seniors became Howie Casey and the Seniors, and that was in a band that included Derry Wilkie, Howie Casey, Brian Griffiths and Paul Whitehead. Now, Alan Williams took them along to London to the Two Eyes, and that's where they met a German club manager Bruno Koschmider, and the Howie Casey and the seniors became one of the first, if not the first, Liverpool group to actually go and play in Hamburg. Talking of Hamburg, this was when the Beatles made their first trip. Now, in August 1960, Alan Williams secured them a residency, but they needed a drummer for the gig. Williams told them, no drummer, no gig. Now, they'd seen Pete Best play at the Casbah Club with his resident band, the Blackjacks, and they knew that the Blackjacks were on the edge of disbanding. So they auditioned Pete, and he joined the band. And this was when they changed their name. They finally dropped the silver, and they were now the Beatles. That first Hamburg trip started on the 17th of August, opened at the Indra Club in the Hamburg's red light district. And that was John, George and Paul on guitar, bassist Sue Sutcliffe, and drummer Pete Best. But the whole thing didn't end well. It ended rather ignominiously, as it happens. 3 of the group were deported. George was the first to leave. He was done for working underage, and he was quickly followed by Paul and Pete for alleged arson, interestingly enough. Now, Stuart Sutcliffe stayed on. He's found and now had a girlfriend, Astrid Kirscher, and he decided that he'd stay in Hamburg rather than come back with the other lads. Now, they got back about December, and it was around that time that Alan Williams opened another club. It was the first beat club in Liverpool, and it was the Top 10 club. He opened it on the 1st of December, but it had burned down within a week. Interesting times. So when they got back to Liverpool, they were a sans bass player. And on the 17th of December, they played their first gig with Chas Newbury covering on bass, because Stuart, of course, had stayed in Germany. And this is the first UK gig they did as the Beatles, and it was the first of 4 with Chas Newbury. It was at the Casbah Coffee Club, and Chas had been a member of Pete Best's Blackjacks. He was actually on vacation from college, and he made his final performance on the 31st of December, again at the Casbah. So the Beatles now needed a bass player. So this is when they made the momentous decision, and Paul moved from 6 strings to 4 strings and played his first gig as the band's bass player at the Litherland Town Hall on the 5th of January. The Beatles returned to Hamburg at the end of March, but this effectively marked the end of Sutcliffe's time in the group. Paul stayed on bass. Stu Sutcliffe did play with him a little bit on stage, but he was never really happy there. And the Beatles were now the quartet that, well, we know and love. Well, for our third track today, this one's from 1960, and this is the one I mentioned earlier, Billy Fury, That's Love, and a label credit with the 4Js became the foremost. So here's Billy Fury and That's Love. Well, the times, they really were a-changing. Brian Casser parted company with the Casanovas at the end of 1960. Shortly after the gig at the St George's Hall, the Mardi Gras Arts Ball, now Brian Casser went off to London to try his hand there, and he became the manager of the Blue Gardenia Club in Soho. The others stayed together and formed themselves into the big 3. That was guitarist Adrian Barber, bassist Johnny Gustafson, and drummer Johnny Hutchinson. But Brian Casser continued in London, and he formed various groups down there, one of which was Casey Jones and the Engineers. And in late 1963, for about 7 gigs famously, guitarist Eric Clapton was on stage with them, and that was just before he joined the Yardbirds. He left Casey Jones and became a Yardbird, and for Eric Clapton, that's where the whole story really begins. Now, Derry and the Seniors in 1961, they became Howie Casey and the Seniors when Freddie Starr joined as the second vocalist. Now, they were the first Liverpool group to actually record, and they had a contract with Fontana, and reputedly, They recorded a whole album live in one afternoon session. Now, Fontana matched them up with a London management company, but that really didn't work out for them, and they never achieved the Merseybeat success that they so richly deserved. Sam Leach pops up again now. Now, Sam Leach very nearly managed the Beatles. It's an interesting story. He met them around January 1961, and he'd actually taken over the Casanova Club, and he reopened that. He'd taken it over from Brian Casser, who'd sold it on when he moved down to London. And he famously promoted an all-nighter on the 11th of March at the Iron Door. And it was advertised as 12 groups, 12 hours, rock around the clock, 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. And it featured people like the Beatles, Jerry and the Pacemakers, the Big Three, King Size Tail and the Dominoes, the Searchers, the Remo Four, Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, all household names in Liverpool at that time. Reports do vary as to exactly who was there, but they certainly were. And the venue's interesting. It was billed as at the Liverpool Jazz Society, 13 Temple Street, and then it says the Old Iron Door. So obviously everybody still remembered it as or knew it as the Iron Door, no matter what its new name managed to be. And Alan Williams was ever onwards and upwards as well. He reopened the Wyvern Social Club, but he decided he wanted a sophisticated nightclub. So he'd renamed it the Blue Angel after a club in London. And it had a huge blow-up of Marlene Dietrich from the movie Blue Angel on the stairway. Sadly, it didn't quite make the mark as a cabaret club, so it became a club for beat groups, which was no bad thing at the time. And the Merseybeat magazine hit the streets on the 6th of July, 1961. Now, this was founded by Bill Harry, and he coined the term Merseybeat after a policeman's beat, because what he wanted to be letting people know about everything that was going on locally. Now, Bill Harry was at Liverpool College of Art and was friends with John Lennon and Stuart Sutcliffe, and consequently the Beatles were heavily promoted by Merseybeat. Well, Brian Epstein comes into the story at last. I mean, he ran the Nems record shop in Liverpool, and on the 9th of November, he famously decided to go and see the Beatles at the Cavern to see what it was all about. And Sam Leach is still very involved, and the following day, he organised the first of his Operation Big Beat concerts at the Tower Ballroom in New Brighton. And what's interesting, if you look at the poster, underneath the Beatles' name, it says, by kind permission of Mrs. Best. Beginning of December, Brian Epstein met with the Beatles to talk about becoming their manager. They met at his Nems shop, but they didn't actually come to any agreement. But apparently that was when he started to persuade them to smarten up their leather-clad image. Now, I mentioned that Sam Leach nearly managed the Beatles because on the 8th of December 61, there was another one of his Operation Big Beat concerts at the Tower Ballroom in New Brighton. Now, these gigs he was organising were attracting upwards of 4,000 people. They were enormous. And that particular night, the Beatles backed Davy Jones. That's the American singer rather than the soon-to-be monkey. But the following day, famously, 9th of December, the Beatles played their first gig in the south of England. Now, that was at the Palais Ballroom in Aldershot. And this was promoted by Sam Leach. And it was promoted as Battle of the Bands, Liverpool versus London. Liverpool's number one rock outfit, the Beatles, versus one of London's top beat groups, Ivor J and the Jaywalkers. Sadly, though, it wasn't very heavily advertised. And famously, only 18 people turned up to witness what was the Beatles' southern debut. So the Beatles obviously wouldn't have been very impressed by this, having the day before been playing to thousands of people. Anyway, that was mentioned earlier. After the gig, that was when they headed off to the Blue Gardenia and met up with their old mate, Brian Casser. And Sam Leach is fairly convinced, read in an interview he gave, that was the night that the Beatles decided to go with Brian Epstein And that's exactly what happened. When the Beatles arrived back in Liverpool, they met up with Brian Epstein and they signed up with him on the 24th of January 1962. Now, in January 62, Howie Casey and the Seniors released their first single called Double Twist, and it was written by Freddie Fowle and Derry Wilkie. And Freddie Fowle, of course, was Freddie Starr, who joined them as the second vocalist. Now, across 62, the lineup was amazing. And to give you some idea of the sort of fluidity of the bands at that time, I mean, Freddie Starr went to Freddie Starr and the Midnighters. Frank Bowen, the bassist, went to Lee Curtis. Lou Walters, bass player, went back to the Hurricanes. He played with Ringo Starr a lot. Derry Wilkie to the Pressmen. Howie Casey went off and joined the Dominoes, and Brian Griffiths found his way into the Big Three. Now, that single was the first single by a Liverpool band, and it was a full 9 months before the Beatles' first single, Love Me Do. Now, one of the bands that really missed out on the Merseybeat boom was King Size Taylor and the Dominoes. They were very, very popular at the time. And in 1962, along with an awful lot of Liverpool bands, most of them probably, they went off to Hamburg to play in the clubs there. But they enjoyed themselves and they were very, very popular. So they spent 1962 to 1964 working in the clubs in Germany. So, as I say, they missed out, sadly, on the whole Merseybeat boom, because they could have been one of the big Merseybeat bands. And the Searchers were coming into their own. Now, in February, Johnny Sandon left to join the Remo Four. And the Beatles played their last appearance at the Casbah Club on the 24th of June. And the Casbah Club closed down shortly afterwards. And the Searchers, they headed off to Hamburg in July, a little ahead of the Beatles, and they did a 128-day residency at the Star Club. And when they came back, they took up residency at the Iron Door. Now, on the 15th of August, Pete Best played his last performance with the Beatles. They had a couple of gigs at the Cavern that day, lunchtime and evening, and Pete Best's last ever gig with the Beatles was at the evening session at the Cavern that day. But lots of bands are forming now as well. I mean, the Escorts got themselves together around October, and they had their first single in 1964 in the March, Dizzy Miss Lizzie. Lots of good covers coming out then. And their last single was their sixth single, released at the end of 1966, and that was called From Head to Toe, and it featured none other than Paul McCartney on tambourine. Now, Terry Sylvester played in their ranks, and he went on to the Swinging Blue Jeans and the Hollies. But we're really pretty much at the end of the story now. Beatles releasing Love Me Do, but that's an interesting story in itself, because there were 3 separate recording sessions for Love Me Do. The first was on the 6th of June, and that was with Pete Best. And that's when George Martin took a complete dislike to the drummer. He thought, well, I like the band, but the drummer's got to go. And when they came back on the 4th of September for the second session, Ringo Starr was in the drum seat. But George Martin wasn't that impressed with Ringo either. And they came back for the third session on the 11th of September. And that's when Andy White, the session drummer, was playing the drums. And Ringo was delegated to tambourine. Now, the Pete Best version is only available, well, legally, on their Anthology 1 album. But both the Ringo Starr and the Andy White versions both found their way into releases in singles and albums. And if you want to know which one you're listening to, listen out for the tambourine. If you can hear a tambourine playing, you're listening to the Andy White version of the events. Well, on the 5th of October 1962, the Beatles released Love Me Do, and the world would never be the same again. And as they say, the rest is history. Well, that was a brief look at what was happening on the Liverpool scene before the Beatles and Merseybeat took the world absolutely by storm. I hope you've enjoyed listening to the show as much as I have putting it all together. I find this whole era really fascinating. There's a whole load of information in the show, and if you want to peruse it at your leisure and catch up on the dates and releases and the bands and who went where, you can find it all in the accompanying blog for the show, and that's on my website at www.rockandrollandraveled.com. And if you're into social media, please check me out at Twitter. I'm at RNR Unraveled, and Facebook at Rock and Roll Unraveled. And you see a theme developing there. And breaking news: my book Rock and Roll Unraveled is now available to order directly from the website www.rockandrollandraveled.com, and then you can get yourself a signed and dedicated copy. For the record, the book Rock and Roll Unraveled, it's got a unique 3-part format, and it tells the story of rock and roll from its roots through to mid-1970s punk. Not just the music, but also the social factors which influenced it. It's like the Vietnam War and the civil rights struggle. Well, to round off the show, we've got the song that started it all for the Beatles, Love Me Do. Gave them their first UK hit, gave them number 17. But the one we're going to listen to is the first recorded version with Pete Best. Now listen out for John's different harmonica on this and Pete's different drumming. And this is the Pete Best version of the Beatles' Love Me Do.